Hi guys, I'm here today to talk about the 9 books I read in the month of October. I usually rank books from least to most favourite, but I felt pretty similarly, I really struggled to say that word, about all of these books, so it's just too hard to rank them. So instead, I'm going to talk about them in a random order, and I'm going to start with the ones I have in physical form. So on top of the pile is When No One Is Watching by Alyssa. I was kindly sent this as an advanced reader's copy, and I was really glad because I enjoyed this one. So this is set in contemporary Brooklyn, and we follow a young black woman called Sydney who's living in her mother's brownstone, and she is slowly watching as the neighbourhood around her is being gentrified. So a lot of the houses are being sold from black owners to sort of new up and coming, new money white people, and the neighbourhood feels like it's changing quite a lot. At the same time, she has recently gone on a tour of the neighbourhood led by a white woman who doesn't live there, and the tour was all about white people who lived there and made their money a lot of times through slavery. So Sydney's decided that she's going to make her own tour of the neighbourhood in the hope that she can find out a lot about the black people who lifted the neighbourhood up, who have looked after it for all these years, who've built a community, and hope to discover why the neighbourhood is being targeted so much for gentrification. Whilst doing that, a white couple have moved in across the road. They're having a really rocky relationship, and the man in the relationship, Theo, is unemployed. He is a bit interested in Sydney, so he offers to help her with her research for the walking tour. Then shit starts to happen, okay? So I really enjoyed the first 2/3 of this book. I think this is a really smart book. It discusses gentrification really well. It's really thought-provoking. I think it's also really interesting in terms of this relationship building between this black woman who feels, rightly so, that her neighbourhood is being gentrified, and then this white man who's part of the force of that gentrification. I thought that was a really interesting balance. However, the final third of the book gets weird. There's a lot more action. And I didn't actually have an issue with where the book went in terms of plot, but I had an issue with how the plot was dealt with. So I felt like we got a really thoughtful novel for the first couple of 100 pages, and then the last 100 pages it just sped up to 10 times speed, and loads of stuff happened really quickly, and it was all really crazy. And then at the end it didn't really feel like we were left with a proper resolution for the characters. And I'm alright with an open ending sometimes, but this one just felt a bit weird. So I enjoyed this book, I enjoyed where it went, but I just wish the same pace had been kept throughout, or I guess the final third could have been a little bit faster, but not that much faster. Then we have a YA contemporary, and that is Watch Over Me by Nina LaCour. I don't often read YA, but I do enjoy Nina LaCour's books. This is the 3rd novel of hers I've read. And this one's a really difficult one because, in a way, I enjoyed this one the most, but I also enjoyed it the least out of her 3 novels. So, this is about a 17-year-old girl who has just aged out of the foster care system, and she has applied for an internship on an island where a couple run a foster home, and they pay for the foster home by growing fruit and veg. They're self-sufficient, and they sell flowers at markets. And they appoint interns to teach the younger children and help with the farming. And so our protagonist goes to this island and starts to live in this very small community. However, on the night she arrives, she sees some ghosts dancing in the field outside. That sounds really odd, but everybody else acts like it's normal. Everybody can see the ghosts, everybody talks about the ghosts like it's a completely normal thing. And we then follow this story with 2 plots. One on the island as weird stuff starts to happen and our protagonist starts to question lots of things, and also her past. So we find out why she went into the foster care system, and she's dealing with this really traumatic event for which she feels a lot of grief, and that is playing into the contemporary storyline. So what I loved about this, I love island vibes. I always love books in isolated settings with small communities. The writing style was beautiful, the descriptions of the weather and the ocean. I also loved all the cosy descriptions of the little cabin she was living in and all the cosy soup and crusty bread they ate. So I loved all that, but I didn't feel anywhere near as much of an emotional connection to this book as I did her previous 2 novels. I really cried when I read those, and I didn't feel at any point like crying with this one. And I also felt with this one, like there was a couple of added elements of mystery that were put there just to try and make it feel a bit more eerie, which once you got to the end didn't really make sense. And I can't talk about those things anymore without spoiling it. So yeah, there's just a couple of things that irked me, but I did really enjoy this and I read it in like 2 sittings, so I would definitely recommend it. Then we have Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. I have the advanced reader's copy, so I'll put the proper cover up here. So I've had this book since before it came out, which was January 2019. And I've just been really rubbish with reading historical fiction this year, and I guess last year as well. And I love reading historical fiction in the cold months, so I decided to pick a couple up. And this is a really tough one for me because I haven't read any Diane Setterfield. I know loads of people adore The 13th Tale. And in a lot of ways I adored this book, but then in some other ways I really didn't. If you don't know, this is a Victorian novel that is set along the Thames, I think in Oxford, and it takes place in this community around the village inn. It opens one dark, stormy night at the inn as a man enters the pub. He's very injured. He's carrying the body of a seemingly dead young girl. He then collapses. The nurse is called. She confirms that the young girl is dead. And then several hours later, the girl starts breathing again. And we're following the story as, well, the novel's sold as like trying to figure out how this girl was dead and then alive, but actually it's way more than that. Like that is a small part of it, but a bigger part is who this girl is. And there's a couple of interested parties who think the girl sort of belongs to them. And it's that debate, and there's lots of people involved behind the scenes who over years have built towards the outcome of this girl's life. Does that make sense? So it's quite a mystery. There's a lot of story, there's a lot of plot, and there's a lot of characters. So what I loved the writing style. I thought this was just a cosy, atmospheric delight. There were so many sections I tabbed that were just beautiful descriptions of the landscape, the buildings, the people, the food, just so cosy. And this feels like a fairy tale at points. And sometimes I don't like books that feel like a fairy tale because I feel like there's a distance, but I didn't feel any distance with this. This book also feels super warm. The vast majority of the characters are good people and you like them. However, a couple of really big issues with this book. Diane Setterfield has included a young character who she doesn't specify, but as a contemporary reader you would assume he has Down syndrome. And she's also included a man who is mixed race, who has a black mother and a white father. And she doesn't write either of these characters well. It's actually pretty uncomfortable. I kept pausing and wincing whenever they were mentioned, the way they were described, and the way their facial features were described, and the way people reacted to them. I didn't like it. Now, I think that the author's intention was to write this as though it was a Victorian novel. And without a doubt, people love Dickens, but Dickens was pretty fucking awful in how he wrote about certain type of people. Anyone who wasn't the norm, Dickens doesn't write nicely about them, which is a massive reason why I don't read Dickens. And I just think that I get that you're trying to make this believable, like this is being told from the perspective of people in that time period, and that's probably how they would have spoken, but it just doesn't sit right with a contemporary reader, so I just wish those elements hadn't been included. I'd almost rather she just hadn't included those characters than she'd included them and done it poorly. So yeah, it really changed the reading of the book for me. So I'd be interested if you have read any of her other books, particularly The 13th Tale, if anything like this comes up, if she writes characters in but deals with them poorly, because I think if that's the case, I'd rather just avoid it because I felt really conflicted whilst reading this book. So those are my thoughts on Once Upon a River. And then we have Scabby Queen by Kirstin. So this book, I read this right at the start of October and I had so many thoughts about it, and I always know when a book is pretty unique because it always makes me want to really talk about it. And I didn't know anyone who'd read this book, so I just kept speaking to Johnny about it. And predominantly I was talking to Johnny about the structure of this novel because it's really interesting, and also the characters are really interesting. So Johnny doesn't really read, and he's not going to read this book, but he like put up with me like rambling about it. So this book opens with a woman in her early 50s called Cleo Campbell committing suicide. And we then find out about Cleo and who she was, sort of, through the eyes of her many acquaintances. I would veer away from calling them friends, because in a lot of cases these people weren't actually friends. So we go back through Cleo's life. The entries are out of order, so we will sort of come to somebody's chapter as they find out about Cleo's death, and then we will go back to look at how they first met her, and then we'll probably come back to them several more times throughout the novel. Some people get more chapters than others, some people are a bigger part of her life than others. She was a sort of one-hit wonder pop sensation in 1990. She was a Scottish folk singer who became a big pop star when she had this sort of political song. And then she'd pop up a lot throughout the years in the papers as somebody who got involved in lots of big political debates. She'd be on like news channels and all things like that. And we get to know her through all these people. Now, this book is pretty depressing, and I will say, like, my mood has been fairly low throughout October, so I think that certainly plays a part in it. But you get a lot of characters, and a lot of them just aren't very nice, and a lot of the spaces Cleo moves through aren't very nice either. So a lot of this book takes place in like really grimy old bars where like men are trying to grope people, or in bedsits. There's lots of poverty in this book. There's lots of people like not being the best versions of themselves. And Cleo herself, she's a super interesting character, and this is why I don't think I'll forget this book, because you get to know her from all these people's perspectives, and they all feel so differently about her. Some of them idolise her, some of them think she's awful, some of them think she's completely fake and like all the political stuff is just to be in the papers and to get attention. Some of them think she uses people and throws people under the bus, and other people think that she holds people up and never puts herself first. So it's really interesting, and you can sort of come to your own conclusions. And what I found really fascinating is I feel like you read this whole book, you get everybody's perspective, and you get a tiny bit of Cleo's perspective as well, but you still don't really feel like you truly know her, because it all feels like an act, and through every person's eyes you're getting their perception of the world, the way they view people, so it's always coloured by who they are and what sort of personality traits they have. So I thought this was fascinating, and I did really enjoy it, but there was a sort of section, maybe like the third quarter, where I did just start to feel pretty depressed with how horrible everybody was. And then when I got to the end again and it started to tie together, I started to really enjoy it again. So I would definitely recommend this. I think it's really unique, but it's not a cheerful book, and there's a lot of like unlikable people, particularly like Cleo at a lot of points is quite hard to like, but you also really desperately feel sorry for her. So yeah, Scabby Queen. Then I'm just going to go through the rest in the order they appear on my Goodreads. So we have Supporting Cast by Kit de Waal. This is a very short story collection. I don't really have a lot to say. This is called Supporting Cast because it is about characters who were sort of secondary characters in her previous 3 books. So I've read her 2 adult novels, which are My Name is Leon, which I loved, and The Trick to Time, which I just thought was okay, but I haven't read her YA novel. So some of these characters I didn't know, and also some of them I just couldn't remember. So some of these I loved. She writes beautifully. She's got a really warm, compassionate voice, and she describes people wonderfully. A lot of these stories are about working class voices, people of colour, mainly set in Ireland and England, and I really enjoyed it. But I do feel, in part, I think that whenever I was reading them, I was trying to pinpoint who they were from the other books, so that sort of detracted me a little bit. And I also felt like some of them I really enjoyed, but because I knew who they were from the other books. So I don't know if this would be better to read if you haven't read her other books, so you have no like attachments, or better to read if you have. I just don't know. Some of them I really enjoyed, but it's just very short. So yeah, this was like a 3-star read for me. The next one is another YA contemporary, and that is Stay Gold by Tobly McSmith. This has recently been published in the US, and I was so happy to see it in my local library. So thank you librarians for ordering this one from overseas. So I feel really conflicted about this one because there's so many elements that I really enjoyed and I read it super quickly, but then there's quite a big element that I had an issue with. So this is, like I said, a YA contemporary. It is set in a high school and it's told from two perspectives. Our main character is called Pony and he is a transgender boy who has just moved to a new school. His parents move around a lot because his dad is in the army, and he's decided at this new school he's going to introduce himself as Pony, as a boy, and he's not going to tell people he's transgender because he's had lots of problems in previous schools and he just wants people to see him for who he is. However, very early on in him arriving at the school, he starts to be interested in a girl at the school. She is a cheerleader, and we then see from her perspective that she's pretty interested in Pony, but she has sworn off boys, so she doesn't want to have any more relationships because she's just had a difficult breakup. And you follow their story as they first start to become friends, and then perhaps something more, and then obviously you follow the conflict that Pony's in about whether he tells her about his past or whether that matters and how she'll feel about it, and we go from there. Don't really want to say anything more than that. So what I enjoyed about this book is that it's really readable. I really like the writing style. I found Pony to be a much stronger character than the female protagonist. I can't remember her name, which sort of shows you that. So I much preferred reading his sections. My issue with this book is that Pony has a friend who is also transgender, and that friend is very into activism to do with being transgender, and they have lots of debates with Pony throughout the book about the fact that Pony is trying to keep their gender identity a secret. So they think that Pony should be loud and proud and speaking up for other transgender people by not being ashamed of it. And that becomes a really big narrative towards the end of the novel, and I just don't agree with it. And it's really hard to talk about this without spoiling it. Something awful happens towards the end of this book, and the narrative of that other character who has been saying to Pony, you should have been public, you should have let everybody know, sort of wins out. And actually that character goes to a really liberal school where lots of people are really open about their identities and everybody's really cool and like really inclusive, and Pony isn't at a school like that, and Pony's in a situation where it could be unsafe to reveal their trans identity. And I don't feel like that was, I feel like a trans teen could read this and feel like, well, I have to be loud and proud even if I'm unsafe. So whilst I really enjoyed this, I had some issues with the way this was tied up, and also the female character gets to have this sort of big sort of speech towards the end where she talks about trans rights, and I felt like that she was the wrong person to be doing that. Like, she'd been a bit not great previously, and then all of a sudden she's like super woke and like she's the one who's changing people's minds, which I didn't love. So I definitely read more books from this author. I just think that in the end they went the wrong direction, and I read lots of reviews on this one from trans reviewers who said this completely and had big issues with it, and felt like this was a really dangerous sort of storyline to be putting out there for young trans teens. So yeah, I really enjoyed elements, but I had a big issue with the direction it went in the end. Then we have Red Dust Road by Jackie Kay. This is a memoir, and I listened to this on audio, and it's narrated by Jackie Kay. And this was a really interesting one. So Jackie Kay was adopted in Scotland by two white parents, but she is mixed race. And as she grows, she decides she wants to find out about her birth parents and she wants to trace them. She finds out that her father is from Nigeria and he was visiting Scotland for university, and she finds out that her mother is a white Scottish woman, I think from the Highlands, can't quite remember. And she decides to trace them. The odd thing about this book is that it's told in non-chronological order, in like really little snippets of memories, And so it opens with her meeting her father and being a bit disappointed in that meeting. And then we go in completely different orders and we finish like at a different point. So this is the first book I've read by Jackie Kay, and I'll definitely read more. She's a really warm voice. When she's writing about people she loves, she writes them beautifully. And the way she writes about people in her life, her adoptive parents in particular, is wonderful. The way she writes about her son. She's very compassionate and forgiving, particularly when she talks about her birth mother. So I loved all that. I thought the strongest elements were when she spoke about her childhood, what it was like to grow up black in a predominantly white community, the awful things she was said to her by teachers and other children. And I also, my favourite sections were her sections when she was at university. And they were sort of few and far between, but I just felt like that's when her voice was at its strongest, and I'm not quite sure why. I just really enjoyed those sections. My issue with this was I didn't really understand why it was in non-chronological order. I quite enjoy when people play with the narrative order and style, but I just question why for this one. I don't really think it worked. So I enjoyed this one, but I didn't love it. Okay, we're on the last two. So we have a romance, and that is Evie Drake Starts Over by Linda Holmes. This is another US publication that I saw in my library. I was very happy to see, and I really enjoyed this one. I have started reading romance this year. I've not read many, maybe 5 or 6. And I find a lot of romances are like pretty insta-love and quite plot heavy, and that doesn't really work for me. And this was the opposite of that. This is set in rural Maine in the US, and we follow Evie Drake. She has lost her husband. He was a doctor and he passed away just over a year ago, but what everybody doesn't know is that the day he died in a car accident, she was planning to leave him in secret and she hadn't told anybody. And so then when he dies, and he's this sort of famous doctor in the area and everyone adores him, everybody thinks that she should be grieving, and she has to sort of fake this grief, and she feels like she's living this lie, and she feels like she can't tell anybody that he was actually quite awful and sort of emotionally abusive to her for many years. And she's running out of money, so one of her friends says, well, I've got a friend who needs a quiet place to stay and he would be happy to rent a room in your house. And so she agrees. So it turns out that this guy is actually a very famous baseball player. I'm really bad at sport, particularly American sport. And he has, is it called the yips? He can't play anymore, there's something wrong with his arm, and he doesn't know whether it's physical or mental, and he's tried all these things for like a year, and he's finally accepted that his sporting career is over and he just wants to get away, somewhere quiet, away from the media. And then you follow them over the course of over a year, which I loved, as their relationship slowly develops. It's set across seasons, and like, you know, sometimes weeks will go by in between chapters and you'll just suddenly be with them like in the new year or something. And what I loved, the cosy small town vibes, I loved all that. I really enjoyed how slowly their relationship blossomed. They're both dealing with their own things. It makes complete sense they wouldn't just fall head over heels for one another immediately. So I thought this was like a believable romance. So I really enjoyed this one. I still find that like these sort of books aren't gonna like super stay with me. And I do also find that these characters were written pretty traditionally, in that he was a pretty sort of stereotypical like man's man. And there was a couple of points where, like, for example, he called somebody a girl once and Evie corrects him and calls her a woman. So there's obviously like, she's trying to make a couple of points here, but in general they felt very traditional, and I'm just a bit more interested in more like non-conforming relationships, and this wasn't that. So this was quite stereotypical, but it was cosy and I did enjoy it, and I would read any other books she writes. Okay, last one. This one's gonna be difficult. This is The Confessions of Frannie Langton. Now, I cannot say this name, okay? Like, I can say Sara and I can say Sara, but I cannot say Zara with an S. So it's that, Collins. I've got a friend who's called it. I literally can't say it. I've tried so many times. It's really frustrating. So, that's her name. You can see it on the book, wherever I've put it. So this is another historical fiction novel that I decided to pick up, and I think it actually came out around the same time as Once Upon a River. And I heard some mixed reviews for this one, but I sort of continued to be intrigued by it, so I decided to give it a go. So this is about a young woman called Frannie Langton. The book opens with her in prison. She is a mixed race maid who has been accused of killing her master and mistress. And then she starts to write her story to her lawyer, and you're reading that. And she goes all the way back to her childhood, where she grew up on a sugar plantation in Jamaica as a slave. And she was brought into the house at quite a young age as a housemaid. And she slowly becomes involved with the master on the plantation. She's taught to read, and she becomes involved with some horrific things he's doing. All I'm going to say is he's involved in like eugenics and some awful research that was happening around this time period. I don't really want to spoil anything. She becomes involved in all of that, and then you know that somehow she's going to get to England, and we find out that he eventually like gives her to this English couple. Now at the time in England, the slave trade had been abolished, but not slavery itself. So you could no longer legally go capture people, abduct them and transport them to the Caribbean, which is what we were doing at the time in the UK. But you didn't have to stop having slaves. So the ones you already owned, you could continue to own. But as soon as they stepped foot on British soil, they were supposed to be free. But Frannie isn't really told that. And then you follow as she builds a sort of relationship with her mistress, and you move towards the moment of their deaths. So I really enjoyed all the commentary about the slave trade and the abolition, and the way even people who thought they were super like liberal and forward thinking were still awful and racist. I thought all that commentary was really interesting. I thought that when she was in Jamaica, the discussion about how she viewed herself as better than the field slaves because she was a house slave. So I found that really interesting. And then when she comes to England and she thinks because she's highly educated, she's better than the white servants, and how like she's treated as much worse than them, and that's a real shock to her. So I thought all of those things were super interesting, and I thought it was a really interesting thing to focus on. And I've read all these historical fiction novels, and I feel like most of them barely touch on what would have been a really important moment in British history. So that was fascinating, and I think she dealt with that really well. What I didn't love was the actual mystery itself. Frannie's quite hard to like. She does some awful things, and because throughout the book she's trying to be quite secretive, you sort of figure out why she's done them, but not really. There's a lot of points where you just think, fucking hell, Frannie, like, why would you not have rather just given up? But then you're not her and you've not been in her shoes, so it's really hard. But I didn't like her mistress at all. I don't think you're supposed to, but I found it all pretty depressing. And again, I will say I was in a fairly low mood this month, and maybe it was that, but I read this across sort of 5 days, and there was a couple of days where I had to really make myself pick it up because it was just unbearably bleak. You just keep wanting to sort of reach into the book and grab Frannie and just say, why? Like, don't attach yourself to these awful people. And then the sort of mystery itself isn't, the whole book is like building up to this big reveal, and it's fine, but it's nothing sort of spectacular, and it's something you could probably figure out with enough thought. So I enjoyed it, and I would definitely, I think the takeaway from this is that a lot of these books I didn't love, but most of these books I would, if not all, I would read another book by these authors. Yeah, I think all, I'd read another book by these authors. So yeah, it was an odd reading month because a lot of these books were really interesting in that there was an element I really loved and an element I had an issue with, and so none of them really became like 4 or like nowhere near 5-star reads, but actually I did still enjoy them, and I would still recommend some of them, but like with caveats. So yeah, that was my October reading. I am hoping to have some 5-star reads in the last couple of months of the year because there haven't been enough, and I would just like to love some books. But I'd love to know your thoughts on these books if you've read them, particularly like with the issues I'd had. I would be interested to know if you had them as well. And yeah, let me know what you read in October. If you had any 5-star reads, I would love to know. And I hope you're enjoying whatever you're reading right now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.